Luka splits a double. Keeps the dribble alive. All the way to the hoop. Scoop to the hoop with a foul. Point 71 and 72.
And one.
Welcome to Inside the Mavs, the official Mavericks podcast of 97.1 The Freak. I'm your host, Kevin Gray, Mavericks pre- and post-game host on the Dallas Mavericks Radio Network. Appreciate you joining me here for the latest episode of Inside the Mavs. If you're watching this on my YouTube channel at Kevin Gray Sports, make sure you like and comment on the video. And if you're listening to the podcast, give it a 5-star rating and write a review for it while you're there. And you can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and wherever you get your podcast for free. We continue to get you ready for the Mavericks taking on the Clippers for the third time in the last 5 years in the first round of the Western Conference playoffs. And, of course, as we get ready for this series, I had to bring in a friend of mine who you know very, very well. You can hear him covering the Dallas Mavericks, talking to Dallas Mavericks, whether it be on Take That With You on the podcast for the Dallas Mavericks or, of course, every single television broadcast. You can find him describing the action. You can find him on Twitter at @MFollowill. Of course, he is Mark Followill. Mark, what's going on?
Hi, Kevin. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, man. Good to see you once again. Yeah. And I'm sure you could appreciate the reference as much as anyone, being a professional wrestling fan as I am. When we got the initial official announcement that obviously it was going to be the Clippers and the Mavericks, the two names that came to my mind immediately were Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn, because these two are destined, it appears, to fight each other for forever at this point because of the fact that they're meeting for the third time in the last 5 years. We'll get into a lot to today's episode, but just your initial thought on the fact that for, again, the third time, we're going to see in very different forms, though, the Mavericks and the Clippers in the postseason once again.
Well, I'm hoping that we're going to see the Mavericks finish the story in that regard. You know,
that's right.
So, yeah, I think since you made that comment, it's like I'm going to lobby that I'm probably going to be very successful at this, but I think we need to move one game of the series to Montreal, and then the Mavs can come out to Sami Zayn's theme. I mean, Kevin Owens has got a good theme too, but yeah, I would love to be in Montreal and hear the entire crowd singing.
That would be incredible. Yes. That was very good, by the way. That was good. That was very good.
That was amazing. So I would love to hear the Montreal faithful singing that for the Mavs. But in lieu of the fact that we're not going to get to do that, you know, this is a tough series. It's exciting. You know, multiple meetings in the playoffs, of course, create rivalries. I think that Denver clearly would have been the toughest matchup. I think we all understand that. But then I think the Clippers are probably the next toughest draw that the Mavs could have had. I probably rank Oklahoma City a little bit higher on the list than some do. No disrespect, of course, to Minnesota, that I would rank them the fourth draw, but you know, they don't have a lot of playoff success. They're just working Cat back into the mix. I don't know how good they're going to be able to be offensively consistently enough in a 7-game series. And, you know, they got a tough series themselves with Phoenix. And I think that certainly the playoffs are wide open in the West and in the East for that matter. And there's a lot of candidates for potential upsets. But as it relates to the Mavs and Clippers, it's a tough matchup for Dallas. I see them going into it as a slight underdog, but certainly I think that this is a very winnable series for the Mavs. But they're going to have to be at the top of their game and be as healthy as you would hope they can be throughout.
Yeah, and not only, you know, have these two teams seen each other a few times, well, what will be a few times in the playoffs, but these two teams, organizations are completely different from the last time they saw each other back in 2021 in the postseason. And even this regular season alone, they're completely different because the last time these two teams played each other was back in December. And these teams, while the Clippers at one point won 26 of 31 games, looked like the best team outside of the Boston Celtics, you know, in the NBA, the Mavericks remade themselves at the trade deadline, and they themselves went on a 24-7 run in 31 games to get to what was 20 games over 500 at the time of their most meaningful games. And for these two teams now, what is your thought on where these teams are relative to what they've been through this season to find themselves back at this point against each other now?
Well, the Clippers clearly have not played this iteration of the Mavericks. The last time that the Mavs and Clippers crossed paths was in mid-December, actually kind of closer to late December. The 20th, I believe, was the date on that game. Kyrie Irving was hurt. And as we know, the trade that the Mavs made, the trades that the Mavs made certainly were a big part of their 24-7 stretch. But Kyrie Irving being healthy was a huge part of that as well. Kyrie just has been so meaningful and so important to what the Mavs have done this year and plays as such a great complement to Luka. and can do so many things that are impactful and meaningful over the course of a game. So not having him there in December was a big loss. And so the Clippers have not seen the Mavs since they've added Gafford, since they've added PJ Washington. And the last time that they played them and came into American Airlines Center and won, Kyrie wasn't there. And when Luka was asked, I believe, the other day about what the biggest difference is between this and the matchups against the Clippers 3 years ago, we have Kai now. And obviously that's a big difference. And I think from the Clippers perspective, if I were to compare them from the team that we saw in the playoffs 3 years ago, I would say that if you looked at their rotation, there's more top-end offensive talent with the addition of James Harden to give them, 3 superstar, all-star caliber players. However, I would also say this, 2 things. When you are expecting a player on the north side of 30 to replicate something that they did 3 years ago, that may or may not be realistic. We'll see as it relates to Kawhi and Paul George. The other thing, too, is while I certainly think that this Clippers team has more top-end offensive talent relative to 3 years ago, I also look at them and feel like that they don't have as much grit, defense, toughness, orneriness, all of the things that really sort of bubbled over in especially the first matchup and to some degree the second matchup between the Mavs and the Clippers. There's no Marcus Morris, Nick Batum, Patrick Beverley, Rajon Rondo. And Rondo, by the way, did play a really impactful role in that series, especially late in the 2021 series where the Clippers game. So, you remove those guys. Reggie Jackson, by the way, who had a history of being a Mavs killer in both of those series. So you remove those players from the equation, you do lose something there. But again, they gain something with Harden's addition. Westbrook's great in the second unit. Norman Powell last season, I think, should have been, if he didn't win 6-man, he certainly should have been one of the 3 finalists, which shockingly he was not last year. So he gives them a really nice offensive threat off the bench, who has a history, by the way, of playing well against the Mavericks.
Yeah, and there's a lot of numbers and things to describe this. But one thing, Mark, that I'm interested in your perspective on, because one of the things I feel like it started to develop as the week has gone on. Yes, we'll get into, Kawhi Leonard and the injury that he's dealing with and what that means for this series. But one of the narratives I feel like is starting to develop is the idea that the Mavericks are a younger group who may be a team, of course, that plays with a lot more pace than the Clippers do. But this narrative that the Clippers are obviously a little bit older now, and what does that mean for the Mavericks maybe having an advantage from a youth and an explosion standpoint, given the fact that they do like to push pace? And can they, for lack of a better word, maybe run the Clippers out of the gym because of the fact that this team is older? I'm talking about the Clippers in terms of, their age at this point. Do you see some of that kind of maybe happening in some of this series based on the way these two teams like to play?
Well, certainly those things are more easily done when you're playing on your home floor. So that would really be something that I would look for in the home games, especially if you're looking for some momentum. If you go out there and depending on when the order occurs, if you split or obviously if you lost the first 2 games, let's hope that's not the case. So I do see that as a factor. Generally speaking, I would see that more as a factor in the home games. But you can run. The thing that the Mavericks are going to have to do if they're going to be able to play that way, Kevin, and push the pace and, as you characterized it, try to run down and run an older team off the floor. That's easier said than done, because there are 2 things, of course, that you have to do to control pace, and that is defend and rebound. Defending the Clippers is going to be a pretty significant challenge because this is a team that was 3rd in the league in offensive rating in the regular season. And as I said earlier, they have some top-end offensive talent. They are a slightly above-average rebounding team, so you've got to rebound. And fortunately, the Mavericks, ever since the trades, are a plus rebounding team themselves. They were, a positive rebound differential for the 27 games or whatever it was that they played after the trades had occurred there in late or the 30 games, whatever it was that they played. And it's hard when you got those 2 kind of throwaway games at the end, but you get what I mean.
Exactly.
They were a positive rebounding team in that window of time. The first 28 games, if you will, that they played after the trade from the 10th of February through the Miami game last week. That was the last time they kind of played a really, truly, genuinely meaningful game. So I think that's the key if you're going to be able to accelerate the tempo. Can your young legs, can Derrick Jones Jr., Josh Green when he plays, Lively if we see him, Gafford as a running big man, PJ Washington as a floor runner, I mean, they got to get out and run. So you've got to be in a position to get a rebound. As we know this year, I feel like that the essence of the Mavs' quicker pace was the pass ahead. That wasn't the whole part of the equation, but that really characterized it as something that was a completely new wrinkle that we haven't seen in the past. So you got to get those guys out of the wings and running the floor and releasing on shooters and just challenge the shooter, release, get down the floor, and hopefully you're in a position for a Luka outlet long pass over the top, those QB1 passes that he made with consistency this year. So it's certainly something that I'll be looking for in the series, and I think could be something that can swing this series in a really positive direction for the Mavs. But of course, the other team is out there trying too. So all of these things, when it comes to the playoffs, especially here, are easier said than done.
Yeah, the chess match will be fascinating to watch between these two teams with all the star power on both of these teams. Before we go any further, let's take a quick break here on Inside the Mavs. And here, let's hear from today's sponsor of our video and our podcast. And let's hear from Aura. Today's video is brought to you by Aura. Do a Google search on your name and email address to see how much information comes up about you. I was devastated by the amount of information that I could be seeing searching my name and profile, and I knew then I needed to be protected for not just myself, but also for my family. Data brokers sell your information to scammers, spammers, and anyone else who may want to target you. Your full name, email, home address, health records, your relatives, it's all out there. That's why I've been using Aura, the sponsor of today's video. Aura shows me which data brokers are selling my information and automatically submits opt-out requests for me. Cleaning up my information not only helps reduce the amount of spam I get, but it protects me from hackers who could use this information to help them access my social media accounts, bank accounts, and other sensitive information. Aura also does so much more to protect me and my family from online threats that I can't see. It's really easy to set up, so I don't have to download several different apps to get things like antivirus, VPN, password management, parental controls, identity theft insurance, and more. I get everything at one affordable price. You may already have one of these tools already, but not having Aura is like locking the front door and leaving the back door wide open. Aura is always on, doing the hard work to protect me and my family so I can focus on other tasks with peace of mind. I value my privacy and I value yours. You can go to aura.com/Kevin Gray to start your 2-week free trial. Please see the link in the description. Back here on Inside the Mavs. Appreciate you hanging out with us through that break there. And thank you to today's sponsor of our video and our podcast in Aura, here with Mark Followill of Mavericks Television joining me here on the podcast as we get you ready for the Mavericks taking on the Los Angeles Clippers in the first round of the Western Conference playoffs. And Mark, before we went to break, obviously talking about these two teams and the direction that they've gotten here, and you can't talk about this series without talking about the health of Kawhi Leonard. And as we record this and discuss this here, we're learning that from Shams Charania of The Athletic, saying that the Clippers are cautiously optimistic that Kawhi Leonard would be ready for Game 1. In fact, having received an injection, if you will, has received an injection in his knee to try to help him get ready for Game 1 of the playoffs. So with some of that information coming to light and having to talk about this series, this is going to be one of the biggest, if not the biggest, focal point on how we move forward in discussing this series. Because
Kawhi is so important in terms of devastatingly effective when he's on his game on offense, truly a 3-level scorer on the offensive end of the floor, and can get his shot off in tight spaces, can make contested shots. I mean, we saw it so much in Game 6 of that series and throughout the past matchups between the Mavs and the Clippers. And then defensively, he can be tasked with significant responsibilities on that end of the floor as well. So that's very interesting. I'm looking here, and I guess, this was like about 30-something minutes ago that this news came down from Shams Charania. So I haven't had a chance to see the story, but that's interesting that he's had it sounds like you're saying he's had a PRP injection, perhaps maybe one of those platelet-rich plasma injections. He did not play the last 8 games of the regular season. That's a long layoff. And then, of course, the week from the end of the regular season to the playoffs. And I know that yesterday he did not participate, is what Ty Lue said. He didn't participate yesterday as we record this on Thursday. So that was on Wednesday. He did not participate in the 5-on-5 portion of practice. Kawhi is a finals MVP, an all-star, an all-NBA caliber player. So, if anybody's capable of doing it, he is. But obviously that's a really, really big bridge to cross for Kawhi Leonard and the Clippers, that he's going to have so much extended time off and then is going to be playing on a knee that has required, that level of care and treatment. Can it be done? Yeah, sure. If anybody can do it, he can. But that obviously adds a real wrinkle and element to the series, that in a season where he had been on pace to maybe play a career high in games, then to kind of falter at the end and be cautiously optimistic. I mean, by no means is that, he's going to be out there. So this is, clearly going to be a very, very interesting story to watch because of Kawhi Leonard's importance to what they do.
Yeah, and everything that he, as you mentioned, he brings to that team on both offense and defense to go along with Paul George and James Harden, and obviously to a lesser degree Russell Westbrook coming off the bench. And we'll talk a little bit about that more as the series goes on. But at the same time, I wanted to get your thought on this because the thing that keeps coming to my mind, and you'll appreciate this, as someone who covers the game, loves the game, and watches the game. For Luka Dončić in his 6th season, this will be the 3rd time he faces the Clippers. The reference I keep coming back to, and I can't escape it, is the idea that, for Michael Jordan, it took him all those times to get past the Detroit Pistons and the bad boy Pistons with the Jordan rules and all the things that came with that. And then he eventually broke through and, of course, eventually became a 6-time NBA champion. And there are certain players and teams that we look at the history of the NBA that just simply had to go through at some point to get to that ultimate success. And I feel like for Luka, the Clippers are his version of the Detroit Pistons, maybe not necessarily to a degree that they had the Jordan rules for Michael in the way that they got down with him. But in a lot of ways for Luka, it just feels like he has to get through the Clippers at some point in order to be a champion. How do you feel about assigning somewhat of that kind of narrative to what he's having to go through to try to beat this team again?
Well, I mean, and those Detroit Pistons that finally won 2 championships had to battle the Boston Celtics in the playoffs, and Isaiah and Bill Laimbeer and that group, Joe Dumars, they had to all go through Larry Bird and suffered a lot of heartbreak. It doesn't always work out that way in the NBA. These narratives don't completely align like this, but yeah, I think there's something to that, this would certainly be a dragon being slayed if Luka is able to get through that. And I think that if he is able to do that, and of course he's not a one-man team, that's what the trades were for. That's what Kyrie Irving is for. That's what putting the team around Luka Dončić, that puts him in the position for them to have the greatest likelihood of success as a team. Because you look back at some of these other series, and it did feel like it was Luka as a one-man gang. I mean, to win Game 4 against the Clippers in the bubble, I think he had 43 points, 17 rebounds or assists, maybe 17 rebounds, 13 assists. I mean, some sort of never been before done stat line in NBA history.
Which you say a lot about Luka.
yeah, for sure. And I mean, in 2021, Jalen Brunson was neutralized down to a 10-minute player by the end of the series after being pretty good in the first couple of games. They were having to start Boban. They were having to play Trey Burke significant minutes. So, yes, I do agree with that. This makes for a really good storyline and really good narrative as it relates to Luka having to finally break through beating the Clippers. But what Nico Harrison has done and Jason Kidd and, the Mavericks front office brain trust as a collective group, which, obviously has had up until recently a very, very significant influence on Mark, obviously. And then Andrew Baker, Matt Riccardi, Terry Sullivan, Michael Finley, the list goes on about the people that are around Nico and all part of assembling this roster and the talent on this roster. I mean, what had to happen was to get the right pieces around Luka and consequently Kyrie Irving whenever he was added as the second superstar to make this thing work. And now we're going to get a real chance to see how well these pieces work in the pressure cooker of the NBA playoffs. And that's going to be the thing. As cool as the narrative is and as cool as it is for, this is Luka having to follow the Jordan footsteps and break through against Detroit, and Luka's going to have to break through against the Clippers. Ultimately, this is also going to be about the people and the pieces that were assembled around him that are going to put him in position to do that.
Yeah, and much like Jordan, Luka does a terrific teammate in terms of Kyrie Irving. And you have watched this team as closely as anyone, and the maturation and growth of not just Luka, but also marrying his game with someone like Kyrie Irving has been pretty incredible to watch in real time, even from the time that they went 5-11 together when the trade first initially went down and the way that things ended last year to where they are now. Looking back over the last year, what has struck you most about their partnership that will allow them to have success together now in the postseason, hopefully, as they move forward, especially starting in this series here?
A couple of things. One, it's a genuine love and appreciation for what the other player brings to the table and who they are as basketball players and who they are as people. I mean, they forged a really special bond. And I think the iconic image of the Dallas Mavericks season is walking off the floor on that April 7th overtime game against Houston, and Luka and Kyrie essentially collapsing into each other's arms in a hug because they were both exhausted from what had been a grind of a game and really, frankly, a grind of a season up until that point, because that was, game number 78 of the season, the end of a stretch of 3 games in essentially 3.5 days. And that was a huge win. So there's a bond that they have forged. There's a chemistry and a togetherness that the two have forged. I would say what strikes me on the floor is, see if you agree with this analysis of what I saw. Last year, I saw 2 talented individuals who were trying to do the best that they can, maybe trying too hard, maybe deferring, being too deferential at times. But I saw 2 talented guys playing as individuals through no fault of their own. It was hard to kind of figure it out on the fly. This year, I've seen 2 talented players that are a cohesive duo and cohesive unit. That's what I see this year. Both players know that it doesn't have to be your turn, my turn, but one understands, hey, it's my time to cook. I'm feeling it. The other guy can defer and stay out of the way, but also is ready to moment's notice to pick up the slack if necessary. And they found this sort of perfect balance of when to go, when to slow, if I may borrow a phrase from Derek Harper, that when it's my time to be assertive, when it's your time to be assertive, whatever it is. And I think that both of them are excelling as it relates to, being very assertive, especially Kyrie, who's super assertive, as you see in those stretches of time when Luka is off the floor. So I love the way that they've come together and played this year. It's really, truly been a joy to watch. And I think that it's a situation where game recognizes game. Both players immensely respect each other's game, and they realize that how potent of a duo they could be when they work off each other and play together like that. And the other thing, too, is they're running actions. They're running offensive actions that involve the other person. You're not seeing one guy relegated to standing in the corner because they're worried, well, if we run a pick and roll, then the defense is just going to switch, and there's not, that's going to neutralize any sort of mismatch or any sort of impact. I'm glad that the Mavericks have moved past that and are now running sets during the game where the 2 players are involved in screening for each other's situations. And, we saw that in the first game of the year. There was a play late in that game where they ran a screen and roll, and someone left Kyrie, and Kyrie was wide open for a jumper, and boom, it was a key basket late in that game. And that's been a theme that's carried on throughout the season.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that, because I think for people who have watched these 2 come together, you have to realize it is extremely difficult to marry the kinds of games that they have, but it's more important to know that the willingness on both of their parts to be able to do so, I think, is what I've appreciated most about how they've been able to come together. Because you've looked at other duos around the league who have played together for a long time. One that comes to mind immediately, is Jokic and Jamal Murray. The amount of time that they spent together, the way that Luka and Kyrie have been able to gel in a relative short amount of time, I think is really fascinating and gives you a better idea of not just their games themselves, but the IQ at which they operate in the game to be able to come together the way that they've had and now allow other teammates to be successful. Because, and you've seen it throughout the course of the year, Kyrie as a playmaker, not just as a scorer, as a playmaker, getting Lively, getting Gafford and other guys involved the way that Luka does at times himself, I think it's really been important to galvanize the entire group that I hope will translate into the postseason because of the confidence that both Luka and Kyrie have given, the other guys to be able to be successful, hopefully, in these moments that they'll be called upon to be so in.
Kevin, for years, I described the template for a player that could work best alongside Luka in the backcourt as a guard who was effective on or off the ball and had enough size to be a rugged defender. And Kyrie is obviously extremely effective with the ball in his hands. He shoots threes well enough that he is a very effective off-ball player as well. And while Kyrie doesn't have the size of the guys that I mentioned in the past, like Drew Holiday and Mike Conley, who I felt like were really sort of at early in Luka's career and at the stage for those 2 players in their respective careers at the time, they were the templates that I pointed to that I thought would be really successful backcourt mates for Luka. But, Kyrie is out there giving it his all defensively. He doesn't have the rugged size of a Holiday or a Conley in their heyday and still, to, it still is Drew Holiday's heyday when you look at, a lot of the things that he's doing for the Boston Celtics, but he's out there giving it his all defensively. And, the other thing too, that Kyrie does is, and this is really, really surprising. And I think it speaks to the maturation of his game. It speaks to maybe we don't know players when we don't see them up close and personal all the time. And maybe analysts project things on players that aren't necessarily true. The feeling always was that Kyrie wouldn't be successful being an out of rhythm player, not getting touches, not getting the ball all the time. Jalen Brunson was really good when he was here at learning to adapt and be an out of rhythm player and understanding Luka's going to have a lot of possession. He's going to have a lot of possessions with the ball, and I'm going to have to like generate my rhythm and my opportunities. And I feel like that Kyrie has been, for all of the people who thought that he had to have the ball to work and be most successful, to be a rhythm player, he's operated extremely well in this sort of, I'm not getting a lot of touches, but I'm making the most of the ones I get. And then when it's time for me to get my touches, I can immediately ramp up and be in rhythm. And so he's been a godsend to this team from a leadership standpoint, a togetherness, a team spirit. He is immensely respected. That's always been something that's been known about Kyrie, is he's immensely respected in NBA circles. And we certainly see it based on what's happening here with Dallas and the leadership and the gravitas that he carries in the huddles and in that locker room.
And that experience will be called upon with all of those things going into this postseason to help out Luka and this group as they take on the Clippers. Last couple of things before we get you out of here today, because we're talking about 6 Hall of Famers arguably in this series with the 4 that you've got with the Clippers. And it goes without saying, and obviously with Luka and Kyrie, future Hall of Famers in their own right. It's about the others for me in this series. I look at PJ Washington. I look at Daniel Gafford. I look at Derrick Jones Jr. Those 3 individuals, especially from a defensive standpoint, and to a lesser degree, obviously with Dante Exum as well, how they get after Paul George, how they get after Kawhi Leonard, James Harden to a degree as well. What are you looking for from those individuals, especially from a defensive standpoint, to hopefully try to bother how good and how well offensively the Clippers like to play, and what that can mean for the way that this series could shape up in that way?
Well, I feel really good about them defensively. PJ Washington, I feel like, is the best defender they've had they can throw at Kawhi Leonard in any of these series. Long, rugged, mobile. He's got the mobility to keep up with Kawhi on the perimeter. He's got the strength to not concede a lot of ground and battle him in the post. So I feel very good about PJ or Derrick Jones Jr. or Daniel Gafford policing the paint. Defense, I don't have any concerns. Obviously, the concern I would have would be on the offensive end of the floor. Will the Clippers play their defense in a way that neutralizes the roll threat in the vertical game of Daniel Gafford? Will they, for example, as some teams do, they know Luka wants to play 1-5 pick and roll. And so you put a center on the small forward. The Jazz did it a lot with Rudy Gobert and Dorian Finney-Smith. Zubats could play on Derrick Jones Jr., which would mean rather than getting Daniel Gafford involved in the pick and roll, then he's calling up Derrick Jones. And Derrick can play in the 4-on-3, and he can be a roll man. And obviously he's a high flyer, and you can do some things in that regard, but it's not as effective. And we know Luka loves when Zubac switches on to him, and he loves to shoot jumpers on him or drive past him or whatever. So I'm curious about how the Clippers defend, because in one strategy that they could do, they could mitigate to some degree the vertical game and the 1-5 pick and roll, and then also clog the lane and say, we don't want Luka breaking down the defense. We don't want him getting stuck on Zubac in these switch situations. And we're not going to let them get 18 dunks a game like the Mavericks did against the Utah Jazz. We're going to play off shooters. And until PJ Washington Jr. and Derrick Jones Jr., and to a lesser degree, whenever he comes into the game, Dante Exum, those guys have to be able to hit threes. And Hardaway in the minutes that he plays, Kleba in the minutes that he plays, all of those individuals who have had good moments this year, but also have had some rough patches when it comes to their outside shot, they're going to be very, very important on the offensive end of the floor. I have no concerns about them, or no real concerns. Obviously, it's going to be hard to play defense against the caliber of offensive players that the Clippers have, but these guys are going to do as good of a job as I think you could expect anybody to do. They'll have a good game plan. Those guys are going to give it their all. Sometimes it's going to be good defense and better offense. It's the NBA, and especially in the playoffs, that kind of thing is going to happen. My question about those role players and the others for the Mavs is, can they make shots consistently to punish the Clippers if they employ defensive strategies to try to mitigate the vertical game and the lobs to Daniel Gafford and the effectiveness of that?
Yeah, that's where my number one X factor comes in for me. Can PJ Washington, Derrick Jones Jr., Dante Exum, and these guys knock down enough shots from the outside to punish the Clippers for leaving them up? Because I think early on, the Clippers will dare these guys. Okay, PJ Washington, you're a 32% three-point shooter. Are you going to hit enough threes, especially from the corner, to be able to make us pay for leaving you wide open? Same with Derrick Jones and Dante Exum. If they can, I think that will command a little bit more respect for the Mavericks offensively, and then obviously opening things up for Luka and Kyrie. But yeah, that's what I'm going to be initially looking for in that first game, is how comfortable are these shooters going to be being able to knock down shots to hopefully make the Clippers pay in respects in that way.
Think of how hard the game against Denver was to win. And it was a hell of a win for the Mavs back on St. Patrick's Day. But that was the game, if you recall, when the only people that made threes were Luka and Kyrie. And the non-Luka and Kyrie players in the team went 0 for 13 or 0 for 15 or whatever it was. They were on threes, 0 for 16. I don't remember what the exact number was, but it was 0 for something. It was a big donut that day on threes. And so look at how difficult it made that game for the Mavs to beat Denver. And they won it because of their size and their rebounding presence and some physicality on defense, and then the special offensive talents of Luka and Kyrie at the end of the game. But they had a significant fourth quarter lead, and they lost that lead because other people could not step up and knock down outside shots in lieu of, you know, the ball being forced out of Luka and Kyrie's hands in important situations. So yeah, that's a really big storyline to watch in this series. If they can be adequate three-point shooters, then, you know, I think we've got a real chance for the Mavericks to move on here.
Yeah, winning and playing in a variety of ways. The Mavericks have learned how to do that throughout the course of the second half of the season. Last thing before I let you go, how does this series get won by the Mavericks, given all the things that we've talked about, these players, the storylines, the coaching matchup with Jason Kidd and Ty Lue, and what that means for the series? How did the Mavericks ultimately get this done against the Clippers this time around?
Well, look, they need to be the most healthy team, which in 2020 quite clearly was a problem whenever Porzingis got hurt during that series. So that, of course, is a factor. I think that, as you brought up earlier, I would love to see if the Mavs play games that are more in line with their pace, which is in the top 10 in the league, as opposed to the Clippers, which have a pace, who play at a pace that's down amongst the bottom five in that vicinity. You know, so can the Mavs play at a high enough tempo to be able to, as you put it earlier, especially in home games, can they really run the older Clippers players into the ground and off the floor? That's going to be a real element to it. As we said, other people have to be able to hit shots. There's just got to be a consistent threat from the outside amongst the role players, amongst the 3-and-D individuals on this team. By the way, you know, we were talking about PJ and Daniel Gafford and Jones and all those guys. PJ hasn't been in the playoffs before. Daniel Gafford's played in the playoffs one time in a first-round series against the Wizards. Dante Exum has had 2 times in the playoffs, but those were several years ago. Now, I do think his experience of high-leverage EuroLeague games, particularly at Partizan in Serbia last year, will serve him well. But, you know, these are all a little bit unknowns, how these guys are going to play in a high-pressure stakes, super competitive playoff series. So those guys have to be mature enough and have the wherewithal to raise their games and not succumb to the bright lights and big stage of the playoffs. So I think that's another factor in here as well, where those guys are going to have to hit the ground running, and there can't be you got to be ready. I'll say what Derek has always said on the broadcast, what Harp has always said. When the playoffs come around and the games start, if you're getting ready, it's too damn late. You got to be ready. And so these guys for the Mavs have to be ready. They can't be getting ready before the national anthem or for game one, because otherwise they're going to be stuck in the mud and the game's going to pass them by in that particular case. And then, of course, you know, then it's going to come down to the fourth quarter, and then whose stars are going to be able to put their stamp on the game in the fourth quarter. You know, Luka and Kai, and whether it's George, Leonard, Harden, whomever it is. You know, and by the way, I think right now bench scoring concerns me. Norman Powell and Russell Westbrook are better bench scorers than anybody the Mavs are going to be bringing off the bench from a consistent standpoint. If Hardaway can hit his stride, depending on how much he plays, we'll see how the rotation works out in that regard. Will he get consistent minutes? Will he get some time out on the floor? And if you got it, you're staying in. If you don't have it, we're not going to mess around for very long. I mean, there's so many factors. There's there's a lot of layers to this series, and I gave you a lot of things that are keys for the Mavericks there. But I really, really think that when you look at this ecosystem and how things are all set up within the Mavericks, it's contingent upon a lot of things. They're going to have to play very, very good basketball against the Clippers. They're just simply, they're not going to be able to sleepwalk and stumble and their way through this series. This is not an easy series. Obviously, this is not a 1-8 matchup. It's a 4-5 matchup. You don't have home court advantage, and the Clippers have some very, very good, as you put it, potentially 4 Hall of Fame players on their team. And Paul George, I guess, would be the only question, and he's probably going to be a Hall of Famer. I mean, I don't even know that he's actually a question. So this is it's a hell of a series, man. I can't wait.
No, it should be great, and I feel like the Mavericks relish this position. You think about the Western Conference final run that they made. Utah, they weren't ever the same after the Mavericks got done with them. The Suns were never the same after the Mavericks got done with them.
Yeah, they wrecked that Monty Williams, DeAndre Ayton relationship.
That's right. And now the Clippers, they've got a lot of decisions to make it, because if they don't get it done in this first round series, they may look completely different going into the 24-25 season. So maybe the Mavericks like this time of the year where they can maybe put an organization into somewhat dysfunctional chaos, if you will.
It wouldn't hurt me at all if they did that. Yeah, that would be fun. That would be fun. Hey, we're going to be on Bally on games 2 and 3 and 5 and 6 in the series due to national network exclusivity rights. We won't be on game 1. We won't be on game 4, which sucks. Normally I would give you the political response to that kind of thing. But, when it's in the regular season, the schedule comes out, way ahead of time. It is what it is. When you find out a few days before, I mean, it stinks, man. But we'll be back for the games 2, 3, 5, and 6. And whoever can watch us, we certainly hope that you'll be tuning in to us and throw some love and support our way. We really appreciate our loyal and faithful MFFL viewers. And so just a little plug for that. To check us out on Valley Sports when we're able to do these games in the first round, which again will be 2, 3, 5, and 6, and then we'll see about 7. But Kevin, it's great to talk to you as always, man, and I'm just really looking forward to this series.
Well, thank you so much for the time as always, Mark. I really appreciate it, man. See, he's playing me off is what he's doing. He's like, it's Kevin's time to go now. It's time to go now. I got the hint for sure. Mark, thank you so much for the time, man. I appreciate it.
See you, Kev. All the best, my friend. Take care.
That'll do it for this episode of Inside the Mavs. Again, thank you to the television voice of the Dallas Mavericks, Mark Followill, for joining me here on this episode. Make sure you like and comment on the video if you're watching this on my YouTube channel at Kevin Gray Sports, and make sure you download and subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcast for free. Remember, Inside the Mavs, the official Mavericks podcast of 97.1 The Freak. My name is Kevin Gray, and I'll talk to you again this week to get you ready for the Mavericks and Clippers here on Inside the Mavs. We'll talk to you later. Peace.